If you love woodworking and guitars as much as I do, then you'll want to stick around to see how I took two of my biggest passions and put them into this gorgeous, custom-built desk. You'll get to see exactly how I incorporated bent lamination and chop sawn veneers to really make it stand out. First order of business is knocking out the top. It's pretty basic at first, and we're starting with 8/4 oak boards. I needed to cut them down to manageable sizes in order to fit them on my joiner and maneuver everything around the shop a lot easier. I used a bandsaw to safely rip them down to the manageable sizes I was talking about. When it comes to milling, I do it the same way I've seen in most other shops. I like to flatten one side on the joiner first and then run it through the planer. This allows me to choose which edge I want to joint at 90 degrees. My table saw really isn't equipped to handle anything super thick, so I switched out my combo blade for this thick stock rip blade to rip the boards to their final width. After everything was milled, I applied a generous amount of Titebond II and clamped up the panel. Taking your time milling up everything properly is crucial for a good panel glue up. Once it was dried, I smoothed out the top and the glue seams with 120 grit sandpaper before cutting everything else down to size. A track saw would be nice, but for now I have a 60-tooth blade and my cheap circular saw, and it works just fine with the clamp-on straight edge. I find perfectly rectangular tables kind of boring, so I try to add curves anywhere possible. This 5-gallon bucket lid worked great for the front corners. Using a jigsaw, I cut close to the line, then sanded it down with a palm sander. I did the same thing to the back corners but used a smaller radius. I also cut a relief on the front of the desk to make more space for my arms to rest later on. After everything was sanded to 180 grit, I added a 1/2 inch round over to the top and a 1/4 inch round over to the bottom, then sanded everything with 180 grit one more time. For finish, I mixed some Rubio Monocoat cotton white and charcoal colors. This turned out to be a really cool slate gray, making the grain appear to be aged a bit. This ultimately was a big mistake on my end and a blessing at the same time. I'll explain why in a bit and show how I fixed what I didn't like. Now that the top was essentially done, I needed to start the first leg assembly. All I had was an idea in my head and nowhere to turn, so it took some time and trial and error, along with the fear of the unknown. I used my own Cordoba guitar to trace an outline onto some MDF. The goal was to make a bending form to create a guitar-shaped table leg. I cut out the majority of the waste on the bandsaw, and since I didn't like changing my blade, I had to make a bunch of relief cuts to get around the tight curves. I finalized the shape on a spindle sander, sanding right up to the line and making everything smooth. The first guitar panel acted as a template to make 5 more panels. I used dowels to keep everything in place so glue up wouldn't be a huge pain in the ass afterwards. It was a tedious procedure of drilling dowel holes, cutting waste on the bandsaw, and flush trimming every piece until I had 6 to stack and glue. After the form dried, I smoothed it out with 80 grit sandpaper and this foam pad, which allowed me to follow the form's curves rather than destroy it. Like I said earlier, all I had was an idea in my head, so I thought drilling holes in the form for clamps would be the most efficient solution, but I was horribly wrong. You'll see why really soon. There's a lot of talk about what thicknesses your pieces should be for bent lamination. I discovered it all comes down to the curve. I prepared some oak using the traditional milling method, then resawed multiple pieces at approximately 1/8 of an inch thick. After resawing, I ran each piece through the drum sander and believe I ended up around 1/25 of an inch thick. Before glue up, I cut a piece of cork to protect the workpiece from marring and to help spread the clamping pressure. Titebond III was the glue of choice, so I lathered the strips up and prepared for clamping. I anxiously took off the clamps and discovered the most terrifying, disgusting, hideous bent lamination I could have ever imagined. It was lumpy with multiple areas completely unglued. So, I decided to burn this abomination and start all over. This time I created a secondary form which would clamp down with equal pressure on all sides, following a similar method to the original form. I also came up with the last minute idea to add walnut to the interior curve, and it turned out to be the best decision I made for the desk. The contrast turned out insane. After the sketchy cuts on the bandsaw, The curves had beautiful glue lines and contrast between the wood species. A quick jig helped me cut equal and straight edges on the bent lamination by creating 3 points of contact to the curves. The 3 points of contact on the jig eliminate measuring and clamping, but the jig itself didn't let my table saw cut all the way through, so I had to finish it off with the flush cut saw. I used CA glue and Titebond II to glue up the edges, then ran it through the drum sander to smooth it out and get equal thickness. Additionally, I added a 1/4 inch round over to both sides of the interior and exterior of the guitar shell to smooth it out. I applied my own mix of 2 parts boiled linseed oil, 1 part high gloss polyurethane, and 1 part mineral spirits. The linseed oil delivers the thinned out poly deep into the wood, leaving a gorgeous shine that appears to be coming out of the wood with a satin finish. So a decision to risk it all was made, and somehow I successfully routed a straight line on a curved surface to make room for joint supports. The joint supports were just cut-offs from leftover oak, which were glued into the routed lines. I'm mostly a power tool worker, but damn, I love when I get to use a block plane and chisels. So that's exactly what I did to bring these oak strips down to a final thickness and shape. A quick sanding with 200 grit and a reapplication of my aforementioned homemade finish, and this guitar shell was shining. Next issue was making something to attach the guitar to. I quickly milled up some oak boards and recessed some 1-inch holes in them to mount dowels and bolts, which would later attach to the table. I got these 1-inch Makita dowels from Belforest Products, and the grain on them is absolutely stunning. Belforest isn't even aware I exist, I just simply love the quality of their products and how fast they ship. I cut 2 longer dowels to act as legs and a short dowel to mount the guitar to the base. A quick dry fit to ensure it all fits correctly, and a quick plug to fix a mistake of drilling in the wrong hole. I used a block plane to outline a thumbnail style radius to the base supports and quickly knocked it out on the spindle sander. The final touch to these was a 1/4 inch round over to the bottoms and a massive 3/4 inch round over to the tops. I definitely ended up with some hideous tear out on one corner, but we'll hide that in the back of the table. After it was assembled and glued, I added some finish, and this thing turned out to be way better than I expected. We're finally going to address this hideous contrast. I love Rubio, but in this instance, I really like how much my homemade finish turned out, and I wanted to make the top match. Before fixing it, I went ahead and pre-drilled all the holes for my threaded inserts, and I marked each point with these dowel pointer thingies. Using 1/4 inch inserts and 1/4 inch bolts will allow expansion and contraction for the tabletop, since I'm drilling 3/8 inch holes for the installation. Rubio molecularly bonds to the wood surface, so it's not easy to remove. This actually worked in my favor, as certain parts of the grain retained a gray color enough to maintain good contrast, but sanding took absolutely forever. The final look with the random parts of gray peeking through where the Rubio stayed made it worth it when the finish was applied. The next part of this build was the second leg assembly, which is going to be a cabinet I wanted to veneer with this walnut. I made sure to cut outside of any major knots that would ruin the veneer, then cut everything down to manageable sizes. Milling is absolutely imperative to good veneers, so I followed the same process, making sure to keep everything as square as possible. This walnut is super old and contains some awesome sapwood, and generally you don't want that, but for book matching, it's perfect. When making veneer, I found it best to resaw 1/8 of an inch pieces, then run it back over the jointer before each cut, leaving a smooth surface to run against the fence. I ran each piece through the drum sander, but left them thick enough for final sanding after they were applied. As you can see, the sapwood really makes these book matches pop, and the colors are amazing. For the edge banding, I used this board that had pith running straight through it. You can see to the sides of the pith there are actually perfectly vertical grain patterns, which make for some stable and pretty edges. I just followed the same process for the veneers, but laid the board flat rather than on its edge when cutting. I tape the panel together to hold everything in place while the glue dries. I used Unibond 1 for the glue up and made sure to spread out even coats on the plywood substrate and the veneer panel. Once I had everything square and in place, I let it sit in the vacuum press for a few hours and pulled it out to apply the edge banding. I made clamping cauls out of scrap ply, which helped provide even pressure for the glue up, and then flushed everything up with a block plane and flush cut saw. Nothing fancy was done joinery wise, I just cut rabbet joints to easily keep everything square. I also made sure to cut a 1/4 inch groove for the back panel with a 1/4 inch spiral bit. After sanding everything to 180 grit, I finally got to see how gorgeous these panels look with some of the linseed oil poly blend finish. Just look at how gorgeous that grain is. I know I'll get some heat for not veneering the inside as well, but I intentionally wanted it two-tone, so not your project, not your problem. When it comes to the drawers, I used the absolute laziest method I could think of. I literally cut the sides, added rabbets, then cut some 1/4 inch ply slightly oversized and glued and nailed it to the bottom. After it dried, I used a flush trim bit and I was done with the drawers. That easy. I couldn't think of a better way to get a gorgeous grain match on the drawer fronts other than using a beautiful walnut slab cutoff. I cut it to rough size on the bandsaw and wedged it up on the planer sled to get one side flat because it's too wide for my joiner. Once one side was done, I ran the other side through and had an awesome piece at the end. There was a nasty little bit of rot in the crotch figure, so I chiseled it out and filled it with Starbond to stabilize it. I gave it a quick sand with 120 grit and then cut it to 3 pieces for each drawer. After they were cut, I recessed a 2-inch hole with a Forstner bit in the center of each front. These wave cutter bits leave super satisfying shavings and I definitely hold on to them as packing for Christmas gifts. I used the hole from the Forstner bit to temporarily secure the fronts with screws to make sure everything was where I wanted it. After that, I did a quick sanding, added a 1/4 inch round over, and then applied finish. Once the drawer fronts were attached, I used the same screw holes to add some brass pulls. Final step was to screw the dowel holes into the top of the cabinet for mounting, then move it into the house for final assembly. Honestly, I'm super excited with how this turned out. I finally have my own desk to play and record guitar at, and it's even more special that I have a guitar in it. If you enjoy builds like this, please like and subscribe, because I have a pretty sick new build in the works that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching and happy building.